The ships appearing on the horizon in the autumn of 865 were not the usual predators of the sea. For decades, the coastal settlements of England had lived by a simple, brutal rhythm. The sails appeared, the steel clashed, the silver was stolen, and the Vikings vanished with the tide. But as the sun dipped low that October, the rhythm broke. These vessels carried a deeper, more permanent threat that the fragmented kingdoms were completely unprepared to face. This was not a raid. It was the beginning of a slow-motion occupation, a systematic dismantling of a culture that started the very moment those keels touched the sand of East Anglia. The danger was not just in the axes they carried, but in the terrifying silence of their intent to never leave. The landscape of 9th century England was a patchwork of internal rivalries and fragile alliances, a vulnerability that the arrivals understood with predatory precision. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex were often more focused on their own borders than on the growing shadow from the east. When the Great Heathen Army arrived, they didn't come with the reckless abandon of gold seekers. They brought a calculated strategy of psychological pressure and territorial persistence. They didn't just want the treasures inside the churches. They wanted the very soil beneath them. They wanted the infrastructure, the trade routes, and eventually the identity of the land itself. Imagine the shock that rippled through the Anglo-Saxon world as the realization dawned that this force was fundamentally different. In previous years, the threat would vanish, leaving behind charred ruins, but leaving the social structure intact. In 865, however, the strangers began to dig in. Led by figures of legend and terror, like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan, they secured horses, not for a quick ride back to the coast, but to traverse the interior with a speed that defied traditional defensive preparations. This mobility allowed them to bypass fortified positions and strike at the heart of administrative centers, effectively paralyzing the local leadership before a single spear was thrown. The psychological weight of this occupation was heavy and suffocating. A village wakes up not to the sound of screaming and fire, but to the sight of hundreds of men unloading looms, crates of seeds, and heavy timber for permanent longhouses. The local inhabitants watched as their traditions, their language, and their laws were systematically sidelined. This wasn't a sudden erasure of a people, but a gradual thinning of their influence. The invaders didn't need to destroy every town. They simply needed to control the flow of resources and the legitimacy of the law. By establishing their own legal codes and trade networks, they created a parallel society that slowly absorbed the original one. As the months turned into years, the occupation moved from the fringes into the very core of English life. The area that would become known as the Danelaw was not just a military zone. It was a socio-economic experiment in cultural replacement. The strangers brought their own gods, their own ways of resolving disputes, and their own vision for the future. The tension was constant, a low-frequency hum of anxiety that permeated every interaction between the locals and the newcomers. There was no longer a clear line between friend and foe when the person occupying the next farm spoke a different tongue and followed a different code, yet paid his taxes to a new foreign lord. The collapse of the northern kingdoms happened with a terrifying efficiency. Northumbria, once a center of learning and power, fell into a state of internal chaos that the Great Heathen Army exploited with ease. In 866, they took York, Eoforwick, not just as a prize, but as a capital. They didn't just conquer the kingdom, They dismantled its ability to function as a sovereign entity. By installing puppet rulers and controlling the church hierarchy, they ensured that any resistance would be disorganized and short-lived. This was the dark reality of the era, a sophisticated dismantling of a civilization from the top down, executed by a force that had mastered the art of long-term territorial control. In the heart of Mercia, the pressure was even more suffocating. The invaders used a combination of tactical maneuvers and diplomatic manipulation to keep the local nobility off balance. They would offer peace treaties, Danegeld, that were impossible to keep, using the inevitable breach as a pretext for further expansion. It was a game of regional chess, where the Anglo-Saxon kings were always several moves behind. The threat wasn't just physical elimination, it was the total loss of agency. To live under this occupation was to exist in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing if the next harvest would belong to you or to the silent masters who watched from the fortified burrows. Consider the visual of a winter camp in the 9th century. Thousands of warriors, women, and children settling into the English countryside, turning a temporary military encampment into a bustling town. They didn't just bring swords, they brought seeds, looms, and law speakers. The Great Heathen Army was a misnomer in its simplicity. It was a migrating nation, a mobile society looking for a new home. While the English kings retreated to their marshes and forests, the newcomers were plowing fields that had belonged to Saxon families for generations. The theft was not of a necklace or a chalice, but of the very concept of home. The resistance, when it finally coalesced, was born of absolute desperation. Alfred of Wessex found himself standing as the last barrier against a total cultural eclipse. From the swamps of Athelney, hidden by mist and mud, he watched as the Viking leader Guthrum systematically occupied his kingdom. Alfred's struggle was not just against men, but against the creeping reality that his people were becoming strangers in their own land. Even Alfred's eventual victories were tempered by the reality that the invaders had already changed the DNA of the country. The silent occupation had been too successful to be completely undone. Even as borders were drawn and treaties signed, the influence of the Great Heathen Army remained embedded in the language, the place names, and the very legal foundations of the region. The struggle was no longer about driving them out. It was about trying to salvage what was left of an identity that had been irrevocably altered. This period of history is often painted in broad strokes of conflict, but the true thriller lies in the quiet moments of cultural shift. It lies in the farmer who learns a few words of Old Norse to survive a market day, or the priest who watches his congregation dwindle as the prestige of the new arrivals grows. It is the story of how a small, determined group can reshape a nation not through a single event, but through the relentless pressure of presence. The danger of 865 was that it proved how easily a society can be overtaken when it is divided, distracted, and unable to recognize a threat that intends to stay. Think of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford. These weren't just forts. They were the nodes of a new network that bypassed the old Saxon power structures. They were trade hubs that looked toward Scandinavia and the Baltic, turning England's back on the Mediterranean and the Frankish Empire. The occupation was economic as much as it was military. By controlling the coinage and the markets, the Vikings ensured that even those who hated them had to trade with them to survive. It was a slow strangle strategy that turned enemies into reluctant partners. The long-term impact of this occupation is still visible today, etched into the geography of the British Isles. The thousands of towns ending in "by" or "thorp" are the silent monuments to a force that successfully integrated itself into the fabric of a land it once terrorized. This wasn't a temporary storm. It was a permanent change in the climate. The Great Heathen Army didn't just win battles. They won the future by simply refusing to go home. They turned an island of separate kingdoms into a singular pressurized environment where a new hybrid identity was forced to emerge from the wreckage of the old. The dark legacy of this era serves as a reminder of the fragility of cultural boundaries. When the barriers are breached, the first thing to go is the sense of security, followed by the slow erosion of traditions that were once thought to be permanent. The year 865 marks the point where the English people realized they were no longer the sole masters of their destiny. The strangers at the gate had become the neighbors in the field, and eventually they became the ancestors of the very people who once feared them. It is a chilling transformation that speaks to the power of persistence over brute force. Looking back at the documents and archaeological finds of the era, the story becomes even more complex and unsettling. We see evidence of trade that crossed the supposed lines of conflict, of craftsmen sharing techniques, and of a gradual blending that happened beneath the surface of the grand political struggles. This suggests that while the kings were fighting for crowns, the common people were navigating a new, dangerous reality where survival meant adaptation. The Great Heathen Army was a catalyst for a transformation that would eventually lead to the birth of a unified England. But the price of that unity was the erasure of many older ways of being. The tension of the 9th century wasn't just about who held the sword, but who held the narrative. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, written with a clear bias and a sense of impending doom, capture the terror of a people who felt their world slipping away. They describe the invaders as a scourge, a divine punishment. Yet they also record the pragmatic deals made to keep the peace. This duality reveals the true nature of the occupation. It was a complex web of fear and necessity, a dark period where the only certainty was that the old world was never coming back. The story of 865 is a masterclass in the mechanics of occupation. It shows how a determined force can leverage internal weaknesses, use mobility as a weapon, and implement cultural changes that outlast any military campaign. The silent occupation was a strategy of patience, a realization that time is the most effective tool of conquest. By the time the kingdoms realized the scale of the threat, the invaders had already become a part of the landscape. They had established roots that were too deep to be torn out, ensuring that their influence would echo through the centuries. As we examine the historical record, the absence of certain voices becomes the most telling part of the story. We don't have the accounts of the villagers who lived in the shadow of the Danelaw, those who had to navigate the daily reality of a foreign occupation. Their silence is a testament to the effectiveness of the takeover. They didn't write the chronicles. They simply survived the transition. Their lives became the foundation for a new society, one that was built on the ruins of the old kingdoms, but shaped by the requirements of their new masters. The Great Heathen Army represents a turning point in the history of the West, a moment where the trajectory of a whole region was shifted by the arrival of a few thousand determined individuals. The risk they posed was not just to the lives of those they met, but to the continuity of their history. They were the architects of a new order, one that emerged from the darkness of the 9th century to define the medieval world. The conflict was not just a series of dates and locations, but a fundamental struggle for the soul of a nation. The farmer, waking up in 870, lived in a world where the laws of his grandfather no longer applied. If he had a dispute over a boundary or a theft, he might find himself standing before a thing, a Viking assembly, rather than a Saxon lord. He would see the blood eagle used as a symbol of terror to keep the rebellious in line. But he would also see the efficiency of the new trade routes bringing goods he had never imagined. This cognitive dissonance, the mix of terror and utility, is what makes the occupation of 865 a true dark thriller. It wasn't just about death, it was about the death of a way of life. In the end, the dark thriller of 865 is a story of metamorphosis through pressure. It is about how a culture can be pushed to its breaking point and what emerges from the fragments. The silent occupation was a process of breaking down and rebuilding, a transformation that was as terrifying as it was inevitable. The ships that arrived in 865 didn't just bring warriors. They brought the end of an era and the beginning of a long, complicated story that is still being written in the DNA and the language of the people today. The lesson of this period remains relevant, a quiet warning about the nature of change and the persistence of those who seek to redefine the world. It reminds us that the greatest threats are often the ones that don't leave, the ones that integrate themselves so thoroughly that we forget they were ever strangers. The Great Heathen Army may have passed into legend, but the reality of their occupation remains a stark example of how the silent movement of people and ideas can conquer more effectively than any army on the march. The shadow cast by the events of 865 is long and deep. It covers the fields of East Anglia, the ruins of Northumbrian monasteries, and the legal codes of the Danelaw. It is a shadow that reminds us that history is not just made by the victors, but by those who are willing to stay when everyone else expects them to go. The dark thriller of the silent occupation is the story of how a nation was lost and found again, changed forever by the persistent, quiet presence of an army that chose to plant seeds instead of just fires. They didn't just break the gates, they moved in, sat by the hearth, and waited until the world forgot they weren't always there. Consider the weight of that transition, from the terror of the first sail on the horizon to the mundane reality of a Viking neighbor paying for a cow in the local market. This was the true conquest, not the glory of the battlefield, but the relentless, everyday persistence of a people who decided that this land, despite the blood spilled upon it, was now their home.